Well, good evening or morning or afternoon. We do PJNet Live each weeknight and some weekend nights about 9:30 Eastern Time in the evening. However, we have a special guest who is with us today who is personally known to me, has influenced my ministry, and in fact, through his, 13 or so books, he has influenced the ministry of many. And it's quite an honor to have our friend. Let me bring our friend Freddy Davis of marketfaithministries.org into the picture now. And he is in his study, his library. And Freddy, thanks for taking some time. By the way, folks, this is a pre-recorded version. Actually, Freddy, you're a busy man, so hooking up at 9:30 at night just doesn't always work. But thanks for making some time for us this morning. I recently purchased. I knew that you had written. How many books have you written, Freddie?
Oh my goodness. Total, probably, 25, 26, but in print right now, probably about 13, I think.
I think there are 13 at marketfaith.org.
Right.
But there, of course, could be others. I was attracted to the book Rules for Christian Radicals. And I wanted to comment something. I obviously saw the parallel with Saul Alinsky's work, Rules for Radicals, and I got thinking about the title of the book, and I thought, well, why didn't you just call it Rules? Or why don't you just call it Rules for Christians? Because after all, we're just all interested in more rules that will restrict what we're allowed to do, right?
Exactly. No, actually, my whole purpose with that was just kind of to take off of Alinsky's book and give a little bit of a Christian twist to it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It's less than 100 pages. I was able to read the entire book in one sitting, just about an hour and a half, I forget. But it was very enlightening. But before we get into the subject matter and the content of the book, I wanted to share with our audience the concept that seems to be the linchpin of your writings and of the ministry of marketfaith.org, and that is worldview, which, I think we all know what world means, and I think we all know what view means, but when you put those words together, the total becomes greater than the sum of its parts. So explain to us and those watching, why is worldview so important? What are some examples of worldview? And give us a good clinical operational definition of how you use the phrase worldview.
Well, Mark, you're exactly right. The concept of worldview is one of those kind of things that it seems like we ought to be able to understand what it's all about, but people use that in such different ways that you do have to kind of explain or define it, when you get started so that everybody's on the same page. A lot of times people use the word and they say, well, it's just the way people look at the world, the way people view the world. Well, yes, but there's also a much more specific definition and maybe a little bit more esoteric, though it's not complicated once you break it down. The definition is the assumptions people make about the nature of reality. And while that seems maybe complicated, it's really not. An assumption is simply an idea or a belief that a person has that seems so obvious that no one would ever question it. And reality is just what the way things really are. And so you put those together, and every single person that exists has a way that they view the way reality exists, and it's based on not empirical data or anything like that. It's based on a set of beliefs that they have that really underlies everything they think and do. In fact, person's worldview is so basic that that typically people don't even think about the fact that it's even possible for there to be a worldview. That it's impossible for people to think in another way, because if they did, they would be living in a fantasy world. And so, but the fact is, there are more than one way. There is more than one way that people view reality. and the culture war, the clashes that we see going on in society and in the world are actually a result of those different worldviews bumping against one another. The reason that I got involved in it in the first place, in teaching this and training with this, is that my wife and I were missionaries overseas for nearly 17 years. We were nearly 12 years in Japan. And then after the Iron Curtain fell, we moved to the former Soviet Republic of Latvia, and we were there for 5 years. And the concept of worldview is really a missionary skill or a missionary concept, because when a person goes from their home country, and especially a Christian missionary, you have Christian beliefs that you're wanting to share with people who come from a different worldview background. You have to learn how to communicate the Christian ideas across that worldview barrier to people that actually view reality in a different way. And so when we lived in Japan, we had to do that. And when we transferred to Latvia, it was a country that had an even different worldview background, and we had to adapt to that and figure out how to learn the skills to do that kind of communication. And so when we came back to the States back in 98, one of the things that just slapped me in the face, probably as as strong as anything I've ever had in my life, was how radically American society had changed during the time that we had been gone. And so I had to figure out, how to get my own head back in the game here in America. And so what did I do? I resorted back to my worldview skills and figured out exactly what was going on. The interesting thing to me during that whole process was that as I interacted with other Christians, there was a huge amount of confusion that people experienced or that were expressing to us, that they realized too how radically American society had changed, but didn't really know how to process it and how to figure out what the whole thing was, what was going on, and how to deal with it as a Christian to express, the Christian faith into this new paradigm that had become prominent in America. And I realized at that point that, the change that had happened in America was a change in the worldview foundation of society itself. And that if Christians wanted to be effective in being able to share our gospel message to people who now lived with this different paradigm, that they were going to have to learn these worldview skills as well. And so I think in a very real way, modern day Christians in America need to know how to communicate the gospel across worldview barriers. It is so fascinating to me. I say fascinating. Sometimes it's really frustrating to watch the news, and they get these panels on where they have people, back and forth on particular, usually political issues that are going on, or sometimes moral issues, and you have one person on the left and one person on the right, and they're all doing their talking points. And it's like they're talking completely past each other. Nobody is listening to what the other person is saying. Nobody's really understanding what the other person is saying. They understand the language, they understand the words, but the concepts come from different ways of understanding reality, and it just chew right over their heads. And so that's happening in society in general. And when we now as Christians want to communicate the gospel to people who come from a different worldview background, we've got to be able to communicate in a different way than we used to. Back when America was so homogenous, it was, we had witness training events, that taught particular witness methodologies.
Mm-hmm.
And every one of them start in the same place. I mean, there's different ones that use different words and different approaches and stuff like that, but they all start in the same place, which is that the person that you're talking to already believes in God, and maybe even the Christian God. But they at least already have theistic beliefs, theistic ideas.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's just not true anymore. We may be talking to a naturalist. We may be talking to someone that comes from a Far Eastern religious background. We may be talking to an animist. We may be talking to somebody that has some kind of a hybrid belief system. And there's just no communication taking place if you just take your Christian message and just assume that the other person, there goes my earbud.
While you're putting that back in, Freddie, let me make 2 points.
Sure.
First of all, as an analogy, think of reality as being at one side, at one end of a line, and then there's worldview, and then at the other end of the line is yourself. Now, reality, we are being subjected to reality as if it's being poured through the filter of worldview. Now, what we perceive on our side of that filter of reality is only a portion of selected perceptions of the reality itself. Number two, that's my analogy. I don't know if it's a very good one. You enumerated several worldviews for the people listening and watching this who aren't familiar with the worldview paradigm. Give us some. You enumerated them. Give us some examples of the basic sketch of the foundation, of the worldviews that you enumerated.
Sure. I already mentioned what the definition of a worldview is, and basically, the worldview paradigm uses the answer to 3 questions to really get you into what the beliefs of that worldview are. And the 3 questions are: what is the nature of ultimate reality? That can sometimes, or usually, at least for us, be translated, who is God and what is God like? The second one, what is a human being? The third one is, what is the ultimate that a person can accomplish, in this life? And so you ask a person those 3 questions, and their answer gives you their view of reality. And so I mentioned, really, there's 4 basic worldviews. There's theism, which is the belief that there is a transcendent God that exists. There is animism, which believes that there's one reality, but it's divided into 2 parts, a natural part and a spirit part. And so you've got the spirits in the spirit world and humans in the natural world, and they interact with each other in a symbiotic relationship. What happens in one side affects what happens in the other. And then you have the Far Eastern pantheism, actually, and it's the belief that there is a transcendent reality, but it's impersonal and it's immaterial. Mm-hmm. And so the natural universe that we live in does not reflect actual reality, because our natural world seems personal and material. And so the whole idea is that parts of this life force, this impersonal life force, have spun off, and they're far enough away to where they create an illusion that reality is material and personal. But pieces of this life force that have spun off animate the life forms that exist in the earth. And so the people and the animals, all the living things, are reincarnating generation after generation after generation, trying to work their way back to being able to finally leave the material, illusory material world and get back to joining together with the ultimate reality, which is the impersonal life force. And then the last one is naturalism, and the naturalistic worldview is the belief that the only thing that exists is the natural universe. And so everything is subject to the laws of the natural universe. And actually, in America, the huge worldview conflict that exists that we see, being played out in society is between Christian theism and naturalism. One other thing about the whole idea of worldview, the worldview foundations are just that, they're foundations. I mentioned the four, and then out of every worldview foundation, there are numerous belief systems. And so, for instance, in theism, Christianity is a theistic belief system, but so is Islam and Judaism and Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, all of the religions that believe that there is a God. In naturalism, you have, such things as secular humanism and existentialism, postmodernism. There's just a whole slew of, and they all of them have the same worldview foundation, but they have different other things that kind of distinguish them. And so that's true for all of the worldview possibilities. And so, in a nutshell, that's kind of the whole idea of worldview. And as Christians, really not just as Christians, but even as Americans, we need to understand how this worldview thing works, because if you're in a political discussion with somebody, or if you're in a discussion with someone about education philosophy or legal issues, or the way that the person understands the nature of reality affects the way that they are going to operate in these other arenas.
It never has become so obvious to me. What you're saying is just in an ordinary conversation. I have a coworker who's a liberal, and from time to time we will get in these discussions, and I'll hear the phrase, not only from him, I hear it elsewhere. That's not who we are as Americans. And I interrupted him and said, it is very much who we are as Americans. That reflects the difference in our worldview, because I believe my statement was that no one is entitled to the fruits of someone else's labor.
Well, you're exactly right, and I the same thing happens when I hear that phrase. You hear it on TV a lot. Well, that's just not who we are. Here's the problem that exists, though. When you're talking to someone like that, like your liberal friend, and you're talking about a particular value, and that person thinks that value is important, and you as a Christian think that value is important, and so you're both saying, well, hey, I value that, but what you mean when you say the word that relates to that value is entirely different. And so that's where you have the worldview difference, where you're using the same vocabulary, you're speaking the same language, but conceptually you're speaking a different language. And people don't know how to understand the languages, the worldview languages of people other than themselves. And so that's why you have these crazy debates on TV, and that's why when you're talking to your friend and you're saying that's not our values, that's where that's coming from. You're saying different things using the same vocabulary.
I think before we get into the specifics of the book, Rules for Christian Radicals, let me try to add one more point to the worldview thesis that seems to permeate your ministry at marketfaithministries.org. You have to understand different worldviews enough to debunk them. Okay. Now, you got to be careful studying too much about something as you're studying counterfeit. But at two levels. One, you have to understand it in order to realize that it is false, that it is not true, and then how to debunk it in a debate. But number two, you need to understand the other person's perspective so that you can communicate with them so that they can then see the falsehood of a particular worldview that they may hold. Fair enough?
Yeah, in fact, your point is very, very well taken. It's very important for us to be able to see exactly where other people are coming from, and if we don't, we're not going to be able to communicate. That's really one of the very fantastic things about the using a worldview paradigm, because since you're answering the exact same three questions for every worldview, but also for every belief system, you're answering the same questions. It gives you an ability to compare them side by side in ways that you can't do it otherwise. When I was in seminary and studying world religions or cults, things like that, the methodology was basically, you study one and then you study another, then you study another and study another, and there's no way to really kind of connect them. And after about 3 or 4, you start getting so much information in your head that it's hard to keep track of it. But using the worldview paradigm, they're all answering the same questions, and so you can actually set them side by side and make comparisons. And then also, you can analyze for truth. You can look at, okay, does the way that this belief system answer the questions, does that reflect the way that we as human beings actually experience life as we live out in the world? And you can say yes and no on that, and arrive at a pretty good understanding of what is true and what is not true, what is real and what is fantasy.
I want to get into the book, and time is going to limit us for one thing, but you can't do justice to this book in a short period of time. But let me do my best without giving the book away. I can honestly tell you that what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes, if you really want to go further in this and fully understand it, you really do need to read the book. I enjoyed reading the book. It has helped me. But here's the thing that struck me. The only reason I bought the book is the title, Rules for Christian Radicals, because the use of the word radical in the title reminds me of the kind of reaction that I get from others when people ask me, well, what do you do? I say, well, I'm a propagandist. And you see their eyebrows kind of, move close together, like I'm doing something wrong. And so if I were to say I'm a Christian radical, I think that would invoke a similar response, because a radical is like a deviant, in the mind. So let's start with the title. Is it desirable to be a Christian radical?
Okay, well, one of the first things I did in the book was kind of define my term, because I recognize exactly the thing that you just pointed out, that sometimes the word radical, or usually the word radical, is taken from taken in a negative way. And like I said before, the book. The title of the book, it really is a take off of Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals. And so I wanted to put the Christian perspective in there, so I spun off of that and did Rules for Christian Radicals. In doing my own definition, I made a distinction between a radical Christian and a Christian radical. And again, this is my own definition, so it's not something that that's just kind of out there generally accepted or anything like that. I wanted to define it for my purposes for the book. And the way I defined a Christian or a radical Christian could be just about anything. Somebody that doesn't matter really what they believe. If they self-identify as a Christian and they go out and they express that in a very profound way of some kind that gets people's attention, then that can be a radical Christian. Obviously, even the definition of Christian under that circumstance, I wouldn't agree with. But that's just kind of there's a lot of people that self-identify as Christians that do not follow biblical theology. Then I define Christian radical as a person who faithfully carries out God's purpose for their life. Christianity is a pretty radical belief. If a person seriously lives out the Christian faith, people are going to say, even under less tense circumstances that exist today, if you are seriously living out your Christian faith, people are going to look at you and call you a fanatic, or you're a nut or something, because the Christian faith, when it is faithfully lived out, is pretty radical.
Well, we are called to be different.
Exactly.
Okay? This is one of the challenges and one of the shortcomings of our exercise in organized religion. Christians suffer the same rate of alcoholism, divorce, and every other ill in society, to the point that we say we've got the answers, yet as a group, there's no difference. So I think we should take seriously the notion of being Christian radicals to the point that there is a difference. I could neutralize the use of the word radical and say activist Christian, or someone who takes their faith seriously, someone who walks the walk. I think we're saying the same thing, aren't we?
Exactly, and ultimately, that's my point, that a Christian radical is nothing more than a Christian that takes their faith seriously and lives it out faithfully.
Yeah, a devout Christian is a radical Christian.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, that is the case. A champion Christian. But you do go into the book, and by the way, there's a lot, I would say in the first half of the book, about 20 to 30% of the book is actual scripture citations. So you establish the truth of the content of the book, but then you unleash the contrasting and comparison of Alinsky's rules for radicals, and you illustrate, you highlight, and illuminate how this is actually just a manifestation of naturalism being played out in politics.
That's exactly right. Alinsky himself claimed that he was not a communist. He claimed that he was not a political person. But in fact, he was. His background before he kind of got into the book selling business and trying to do create his community organizing approach, that was exactly his background. But essentially, when you look at his approach, it's straight out of a naturalistic worldview, which is the belief that the only thing that exists is the natural universe. And that being the case, there is no God, and so there are no objective moral rules, that people have to live by. We can make it up as we go.
Other than his rules.
Whatever works, the ends justify the means. That is Alinsky's bottom line. And so he would pick his fight, and whatever it took to accomplish his goal was fair game. And essentially, and so he made up or came up with his rules that really embodied that particular philosophy.
One of the things that I noticed, not only in reading your book, and I've actually never read Alinsky's book. I've heard a lot about it, I've seen a lot of summaries, but in reading your book, some thoughts came to my mind that I see played out in all kinds of arenas. And let me just give you some real-world examples. I said that's not who we are as Americans, but think for a moment. In our discussions about values, about politics, about finances, one of the things that Alinsky says is, basically you've got to keep the pressure on. Ultimately, the idea, attack individuals, not institutions. When you see these polarized versions of political reality clash, both sides are claiming the moral high ground. Let me give you a concrete example. As a Christian, I believe abortion is categorically unmitigated murder. No doubt about it, in my mind. Now, when you say that to someone who believes in abortion, they will say, why do you hate women? Why do you want to impose your religious values on the rest of us? It's my body. I can do what I want. They're actually making a moral argument that it is wrong, it is sinful for me to impose these values on someone else, or impose this on the entire female half of the population. Mm-hmm. That is a moral claim in and by itself. Exactly.
And interestingly, and see, this goes down again to the to the very nature of a person's worldview, that unless you have actually taken the time to study this topic, people's worldview is totally and completely unconscious. It's just the way things are. Mm-hmm. And it never occurs, using your example there, it never occurs to them that the baby needs to be taken into consideration. That the baby that is going to get aborted is actually a viable, actual human being. Mm-hmm. And all they're concerned about is their own values. Beyond that, thinking of it, from a naturalistic point of view, human beings in naturalism are nothing more than a naturally evolved animal.
Blob of tissue, even as adults. We're just a bigger blob of tissue.
But we're just animals, just like any other animal that exists in the world. It's just that our particular species has a larger brain, but we're not any better. We're not any. In fact, there are ways that we as human beings are inferior to other animals. We're not as fast as some. We're not as strong as some. We're not as able to escape.
Well, we're at the top of the food chain, not because of our strength, not because of our speed, but because of our ability to synthesize ideas and communicate them. And you actually point this out in your book. Ideas, communication, the essence of human communication is the transference of an idea from one brain to another. And it takes several forms. And I point out, in evolution, for example, evolution pretends to be a scientific discipline. Mm-hmm. But here's my take. And you may have a book on this, or maybe you will have a book on this, because I don't write and you do. The problem with evolution is that it is an attempt to explain our existence apart from God. And if we can explain our existence apart from God, that means that there really is no God. Now, if there really is no God, we should not refrain or restrain ourselves morally whatsoever. We should seek whatever pleasure we can accumulate. That is the agenda behind the evolutionary model. And I'm not saying that all people that believe in evolution believe in what I just said, but I think it is operative at the subconscious level.
Well, and that's that gets back to this worldview idea. The foundational belief of a naturalistic worldview is that the only thing that exists is the natural universe. And if that is the case, then the only possibility for life and on up to human life, the only possibility for its existence is some kind of natural process. God had nothing to do with it because God doesn't exist. And so everything that you just said comes directly out of a naturalistic, worldview, comes out of the beliefs, the foundational beliefs of naturalism. And then obviously as it plays out in different parts of life, as it relates to evolution, as it relates to politics, as it relates to human life, to various moral values, the expression of naturalism is going to express these things as if God doesn't exist, that as if everything had to have come into being by some kind of natural process. And so that's what you get. Alinsky is what you get.
Mm-hmm. And again, these same people will claim moral high ground based on things that are not what I would call perceivable in the five senses. That they will invoke these spiritual realities, like you're being mean, you hate. Wait a minute. Well, hate. Give me a bottle of hate. You can't. That's not an objective reality. That is a spiritual reality. Anger, hate, love, care, compassion, empathy. All those things are I think, in many ways, unique to the human experience. Although elephants they come close.
Well, what you just said is exactly right, and it is the and when you get into the analysis part of trying to determine if a particular worldview belief is true or not true, the kinds of things that you just said become contradictions within a naturalistic worldview that give an indication that it does not reflect reality.
Right. You will see, and I guess we're going to have to cut it off, but you see, I guess my point is this is in play in our life every day. It's not just some ethereal abstraction of a PhD from seminary called Freddy Davis who writes books and sells it. No, this is real, folks. It is expressed every day in our culture when we see acts of compassion out there. What caused that? Why do we do that? We care about each other. When we express outrage, well, what is the root of that outrage? It is very real. When we hear words like in the Christian community, in our churches, churches are wrestling with the idea of same-sex marriage. Well, the Bible couldn't be more clear on it, but yet the narrative from those who have bought into the idea that, well, why should we hate them? Well, we don't hate adulterers. We don't hate alcoholics. We hate the sin, not the sinner. They've lost this worldview paradigm shift that is occurring in our culture. Christians are not insulated from it. It has permeated, it has penetrated, and to some degree permeated our very churches.
That's absolutely right. We live in a world, and this is one of the insidious things about this idea of worldview as well, is that the worldview beliefs for most people literally are unconscious, and people are not aware of intellectually, consciously of what they are. And so when you live in an environment like what we live in now, where a naturalistic worldview really does dominate virtually all of the institutions of our society. When that is the environment that you live in, if you're not aware consciously of the differences in Christian beliefs and, for instance, naturalistic beliefs, then somebody will say something and it sounds good, it sounds natural, it sounds
moral.
Yeah, it sounds moral. Yeah. We start absorbing these things without even realizing it. And which is one of the really important reasons why Christians need to be aware of this, particular topic, be up on it, so that we can not only be faithful in sharing a witness, but also so we can stand strong in our own faith, understand what the difference is in the foundation for our Christian moral values and naturalistic moral values.
Well, Freddie, I don't know if our time today has done any justice to the book, but I would encourage everyone, if the ideas that have been shared today speak to your heart, I would encourage you to get in contact. Go to marketfaith.org. Every book, almost, none are the exclusion, I don't think, address this issue of worldview, and there are 12 other books, and we could go on and on. I don't know if we could do justice to them. Folks, if the topic interests you, get the book. An interesting thing, that website, you can actually, if you would like to contact Freddy Davis, you could actually do it. from his website.
Yeah,
The same is true at patriotjournalist.com. We are not hiding behind a veil of insulation. We are not unapproachable. So if you have questions, I would encourage you to contact Market Faith Ministries. Freddie, it has been an honor to have you here today, and we just want to do all that we can to empower your ministry in the real world out there. And thank you for taking your time to be with us today.
Well, Mark, thank you. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed being able to have this conversation with you.
All right. Thank you so much.